So, what is the Bible? Is it a collection of myths or is it a record of actual history? That question is at the heart of a really fierce, long running debate. But today, we're not here to talk about faith. Instead, we're going to be detectives. We're sifting through the physical evidence and asking a simple question. What happens when these ancient texts meet an archaeologist's spade? Okay, let's dive right in. Now, the goal here isn't to prove or disprove anyone's personal beliefs. Think of this more as an investigation. We're going to look at some of the most amazing physical evidence that's been dug up over the last 100 years or so and just see how it sheds light on the world described in these texts. We're just following the clues, you and me, wherever they might lead. All right, our first case file. It opens on one of the most famous figures in the entire Old Testament, King David. Now, for a long, long time, many scholars basically considered him to be mythological. With no evidence outside the Bible itself, he was seen as a legend, maybe created to give a new nation this epic origin story. And this is a really key comparison. For decades, a lot of academics put David in the exact same box as Britain's King Arthur. You know, a heroic symbol, a national icon, but with zero solid external proof that he ever actually existed. In the archaeological record, there were no inscriptions mentioning him, no enemy records, just nothing, silence. But in archaeology, that silence can be broken at any moment. And that's exactly what happened in 1993. At an excavation in northern Israel called Tel Dan, a team uncovered a broken piece of a stone monument, a victory stone, that would completely change the entire debate. So what made this one rock fragment so important? Well, the inscription, carved in Aramaic by an enemy king, talks about defeating the House of David. This was huge. It was the very first time a non-biblical ancient source had ever been found that directly linked a ruling family line to King David. It strongly suggested he wasn't just some literary character, but a real historical figure whose dynasty was well known, even to his enemies. And you know how it goes. One big discovery makes you re-examine everything else. This find prompted scholars to take a second look at other artifacts. For example, some now argue that another artifact, the Moabite stone, also contains a reference to David's dynasty. And what's more, it gives an enemy side of a war that's also described in the Book of 2 Kings. It's just a fascinating look at how different historical sources can line up. Okay, so from a person, let's move on to a place. We're turning to one of the Bible's most dramatic, most famous stories, the incredible fall of the ancient city of Jericho. It's a tale of marching armies, blasting trumpets, and walls that just came tumbling down. But is there anything to it? The archaeology of Jericho has been a battleground of its own, honestly. Back in the 1930s, an archaeologist named John Garstang argued his findings lined up perfectly with the biblical story. But then, in the 1950s, Kathleen Kenyon came along, did her own analysis, and concluded there wasn't even a city there for Joshua to conquer. And then, more recently, archaeologists like Dr. Bryant Wood have gone back to Kenyon's own evidence and basically said, hey, wait a minute, reigniting the whole debate. So what was actually found in the ground? Well, if you look at Kenyon's own reports, she documented a few really critical clues. First, the remains of a collapsed mud brick wall, found at the base of the city's main stone wall. Second, a thick layer of ash and burned debris that runs through the ruins. And third, something really curious. Tons of large jars, still filled to the brim with grain. Now, those grain jars are a super fascinating clue. See, in ancient warfare, grain was like gold. An invading army would camp outside a city for months, sometimes years, waiting for the people to starve. And when they finally won, the first thing they do is plunder all that precious food. The fact that the jars were full suggests two things. One, the attack happened in the spring, right after the harvest, and two, the siege was incredibly short. And those who see a link to the Bible point out that these specific details, a quick conquest where the valuable grain was left behind, match the narrative in the book of Joshua almost perfectly. All right, we've looked at a person and we've looked at a place. Now let's turn to the text itself. The Bible is a collection of ancient documents. So for centuries, a huge question has been, how reliable are they? How can we possibly know that the words we're reading today haven't been changed over thousands of years of being copied by hand? And that's a totally fair question, right? Before the printing press, every single copy of a book had to be written out by a scribe. And scribes are human, they make mistakes. So how much has the text drifted over time? For a long time, we really had no way to know for sure because the oldest copies of the Hebrew Bible we had were from the Middle Ages, around 1000 AD. And then came 1947. A young Bedouin shepherd looking for a lost goat stumbled upon a cave near the Dead Sea. And inside, he made what many people call the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century, the Dead Sea Scrolls. This incredible find included manuscripts of biblical books that were 1,000 years older than anything anyone had ever seen before. So, this was the ultimate test. What happened when scholars compared the brand new, 1,000-year-older Dead Sea Scrolls to the medieval texts they already had? Well, the result was astonishing. They were over 99.5% identical. And the tiny variations that did exist were mostly minor spelling differences and obvious scribal slips that didn't change the meaning of the text at all. It was just this powerful evidence of an incredibly careful and consistent tradition of copying over many, many centuries. The Dead Sea Scrolls were an incredible leap back in time, no question. But what if we could go back even earlier? We're talking centuries before the Dead Sea community was even a thing. Could we find any evidence that the biblical text was being used in the daily lives of ancient Israelites way back in the time of the kings? Well, in 1979, in a burial cave right outside Jerusalem, archaeologists found 2 tiny scrolls made of silver, rolled up like miniature amulets. It took them years to figure out how to unroll these fragile things without destroying them. And when they finally did, they found a familiar passage delicately scratched into the silver, the priestly blessing from the book of Numbers, chapter 6. The Lord bless you and keep you. This was an absolute landmark discovery. Dating all the way back to the late 7th century BC, these amulets are the oldest fragments of biblical scripture ever found, period. They provide direct physical proof that parts of the Torah were known, they were being copied, and they were being used in personal worship long before the Babylonian exile, which completely challenged a long-held theory that these texts were written down much, much later. So, wow, we've journeyed from a king who might have been a legend to a fallen city to the very words of the text itself. What's the takeaway here? When we lay all these clues out on the table, what kind of pattern starts to emerge? Well, the pattern doesn't actually stop with the Old Testament. Let's take a quick look at the New. For centuries, the only written records we had of Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor who presided over the trial of Jesus, were in the Gospels. And then, in 1961, at Caesarea Maritima, a stone was unearthed with his name and title carved right into it, Pontius Pilatus, prefect of Judea, the first piece of physical evidence confirming his existence. So let's recap our evidence file. We started with a person, King David, whose historical dynasty we now see referenced outside the Bible. We move to a place, Jericho, where the debate continues but where the clues in the ground are surprisingly consistent with the biblical story. We examined the text itself and saw powerful evidence for its faithful transmission. And we even touched on an event from the New Testament, the rule of Pontius Pilate, now confirmed in Stowe. Look, these aren't just random, disconnected finds. They seem to form a pattern where physical evidence and the biblical record keep intersecting. This is what leads some archaeologists, like Dr. Bryant Wood, to make a bold conclusion, that the evidence consistently confirms the historical accuracy of the scriptures. Now, others in the field would urge more caution, but at the very least, these discoveries show that the Bible is a book that is deeply rooted in the real-world history and geography of the ancient world. And that really leads us to the final and maybe most exciting question. The incredible finds we've talked about today were all completely unknown just a few decades ago. It just makes you wonder, if this is the evidence that has already surfaced, what other stories, what other connections to this ancient text are still lying just beneath the dust, waiting for the right moment to cry out?